This is Jackie Weisfield presenting the case study on missing booster club funds for EDL 854. I began with a summary of the case study, and quickly there's money potentially missing from the gate proceeds that is based on a conversation with another parent who said he used a $50 bill to pay for his ticket, and at the end of the night, when the principal was counting the money and making the deposit, there was no $50 bill present. There were 10 tickets that were not used because they were torn, but they're also not present with the gate materials. They have just been disposed of. Most interestingly, the parent in charge of the gate proceeds, or one of the two parents in charge of the gate proceeds that evening, had come in to talk to the principal earlier that week about the school funding her daughter's trip. Her daughter's a cheerleader and has the opportunity to march in a holiday parade in New York. So, category 1, what I know, need to know, and identifying the problem. What I know, divided into the people that I know it about. Mr. Dumas is the textile mill foreman. He cashed his paycheck that afternoon, so had several large bills. And he told Mr. Stevens when he came into the gym that he paid with a $50 bill. Mrs. Bauman has 3 children who have attended the school, 2 sons and a daughter. Her 2 sons have since moved on to the high school, but her daughter is still there. Her daughter's a cheerleader. So Mrs. Bauman is very involved with the Booster Club. She volunteers regularly to help with concessions or gate at home games. And Mrs. Bauman met with Mr. Stevens to request that the PTA funds that the school has be used to pay for her daughter's trip to New York to be able to march with the All-State cheerleaders in a holiday parade. We also know that Mrs. Bauman was working the gate for the final basketball game of the season, which is what we're talking about here. Mr. Stevens, Daniel Stevens, is the current principal of George Washington Middle School and has been there for 4 years. He does not have an assistant principal that he works with. He has good relationships with the parent organizations, both the PTA and the Booster Club. And Mr. Stevens relies heavily on those parents at athletic events for assistance with concessions and gate. Mr. Stevens has several procedures in place that might prevent theft, which gave him sort of a false sense of security in allowing the gate and concessions people to work mostly unchecked at this final game. And Mr. Stevens rejected Mrs. Bauman's proposal for funding her daughter's trip. So that's what we know about the people involved in the situation. What we know about the school itself is it's in an old residential area of a large city. We also know that the socioeconomic demographics are changing, and those socioeconomic demographics are shifting to a lower socioeconomic status. I shouldn't say any, but many of the parents who were more well off, who were at a higher socioeconomic status, moved to the suburbs of that city. And most of the parents who are working in this city and in this area are working at a textile mill. The enrollment at the school is declining. It currently serves about 450 students. But despite the declining enrollment and the low socioeconomic status, there's still strong parent involvement. So what I need to know, what other additional information would be helpful here, is if someone came in later with a larger bill and the $50 bill might have been used as change. I need to know if either gate person saw anything questionable, even maybe the concessions people. I'd be interested in who took Mr. Dumas's $50 bill as payment into the game. Also interested in whether or not this situation has happened in the past. Mrs. Bauman most definitely has been in the school district longer than even Mr. Stevens. And so if she's been working gate for many years, and if this situation has happened in the past, that might raise some red flags. I'd also like to know where the ripped tickets are to see that that actually happened. Wonder if the other gate person saw the ripped tickets. That's also an important piece of information. It would be interesting to know if Mrs. Bauman and her family can pay for Lucy's trip, or if they're in a financial position where Mrs. Bauman might need to take that money. And I wonder if Mr. Stevens would even suspect impropriety if he had not had the conversation with Mrs. Bauman about Lucy's trip. Is it because she came in and asked for money and now there are these suspicious 10 tickets that have been ripped, and the $50 that would be associated with them not there? Would he even suspect Mrs. Bauman if she hadn't come in to ask about the school funding Lucy's trip? And what are the district policies when money goes missing in situations like this? So ultimately, the problem is there are 10 tickets missing. In addition to that, there was no $50 bill in the cash bag at the end of the night. Despite that conversation with Mr. Dumas, that might indicate that there should be, especially because he came at the end of the first quarter. And so it's not likely that someone would come in after that. He had already missed a quarter of the game. There's not enough administration at middle school sporting events and likely other middle school events, drama, so plays and those types of things. There's a need for better procedures for ticket accounting at athletic events. Just having pre-numbered tickets doesn't seem to have been enough, especially in this case. So my plan of action with my strategies are to contact the appropriate district leadership, begin an investigation, and re-examine my procedures for managing funds at school events. So first, contacting appropriate district leadership. I want to report the situation first and foremost, so that I can review that district policy for the situation. What am I supposed to do? Do they have any advice? Are there any legal implications? What do I need to know? And then I also want to preview the plan for my investigation and resolution, so that again, if the superintendent or human resources or anybody else has any suggestions that I take into account, that those are thought about at the very beginning and taken into account at the very beginning rather than after the fact. And also, I'm going to make a request to District Safety and Security, the superintendent, whomever, to request additional district support for middle school events, so that Mr. Stevens is not the sole administrator at these events. In terms of beginning my investigation, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to review footage from video cameras. If I can see the ripped tickets, what can I do to confirm the stories that I've heard? What happened to that $50 bill? Can I see that? After looking at that and seeing what I glean from that, potentially interviewing the parent volunteers, both for concessions and most definitely for gate, both of those parent volunteers, which would include Mrs. Bauman. Just doing a quick interview with Mr. Dumas to see a little bit more about that $50 bill, who took it, all of those kinds of things. And then I'm going to report those findings from my investigation to the district, and I'm going to follow district protocol based on those findings. I am then going to go back and re-examine the event procedures and implement a mandatory training for volunteers. I'm going to request more district support, and I'm going to implement a clear policy for damaged, unused tickets so that we can still account for them. The resolution promoting the success of all students, looking at the question, what is best for all students? Number one, give Mrs. Bauman other options for organizations who may be able to help fund her daughter's trip. That's going to be what's best for Lucy. That's going to be what's best for Mrs. Bauman and her family. I know that there have been several community organizations that have funded trips for students in the past. Lots of community organizations are willing to donate, and alumni foundations as well. If it's determined that there's money missing, require that it be repaid if we can figure out who it is that took it. And again, require training for all parent volunteers. Now, it's important to get the money back to give back to all the students and allow them to engage in activities in the school. And then requiring training for all parent volunteers really helps this not happen again. And debriefing the problem. I was thinking about if Mrs. Bauman was guilty or if not. Trying to be really careful not to assume guilt, but determine the facts in the incident, how I can assure it doesn't happen again. I'm thinking that the district really needs to provide more support at the middle school events. Maybe it's an assistant principal from the high school. Maybe it's somebody from the district office. And through this entire process, I'm really thinking about how to preserve those parent relationships because they are really strong. I'm also feeling pretty confident that I'm dealing with the situation in the most fair and just way as possible. I'm kind of disappointed by the parent volunteers, and I also have some anger and frustration with myself for not putting in more comprehensive procedures. I'm valuing the parent relationships. I'm valuing the individual needs with trying to find different ways to fund Lucy's trip. I'm looking at student needs and making sure that the correct funds get repaid. I'm also looking for support for the school and valuing that support for the school happen regardless of whether or not the socioeconomic status is low or whether or not the enrollment is declining. And I'm also valuing due process. I'm not making any assumptions about what has happened by whom. The lingering issues is how do we get more help in there for those middle school events and Mr. Stevens? How can the school help get Lucy on her trip? What organizations can we put her in contact with? I'm also wondering how relationships are going to be impacted by this event. Is that going to change the parent relationships that Mr. Stevens has with parents? And are there other parts of the procedures for concessions and gate that are not working that I need to fix? And then I'm wondering, can we pay people to work the events, teachers or parents? Can we pay them so that this is less likely to happen? So if I'm looking at standard 8, effective and efficient management, I need to get immediate support from the district. That is I'm asking immediately before even the next day about what's happening, what needs to happen in terms of the district. I'm beginning the investigation the next day. I'm reviewing procedures and making changes as soon as possible. Thankfully, this is the last basketball game of the season, but want to make changes before the next middle school event. And I'm asking for outside support from the district as well. And I'm only involving those who need to be involved so that I can preserve some of those relationships with the other parents. In terms of social learning for all students, not allowing the use of those PTA funds for one student means that the funds can be used for all students. And potentially some field trips or other social learning opportunities. Still continuing school events even when we're understaffed, really making those a priority, and then looking for other funding sources for Lucy's trip. So I'm also taking into account the student academic learning for all by not allowing those PTA funds to be used for a single student. Again, field trips and those types of things can be academic as well. Also promoting parent engagement. Getting parents engaged with their students is really, really important to student achievement. And then also promoting more teacher engagement also gets those kids more engaged because their teachers are engaged in what they're doing outside of school. So that's my presentation on the missing Booster Club funds. I hope to work with some of you some more in the future. Thanks.